later on, I think when I got interested in music for real, it wasn't the stories that music told, although I did. I mean, I loved Jim Croce and all the stuff that was on '70s FM late night kind of radio, and I loved Cream. But those stories, Tales of Brave Ulysses, was a story about a woman who is just an unbelievable temptress, and you're in grave trouble because she has animated everything in you. So those kind of Joseph Campbell, Hero with a Thousand Faces sort of stories, I think were there very early, and the music was a part of it. My dad was a jazz record collector, so again, not much narrative in those stories. It's usually kind of, come on, baby, take a dance with me, or it's Saturday night and let's have a good time. But with Dylan, I remember Oxford Town, which, here I am. I've been in Mississippi now for 23 years, living in Oxford. But the first time I heard about Oxford was that song. I had no idea what it was about. Oxford Town, right? All because his skin was brown. I'm not hearing the race element of that at all. I'm just hearing his sound, his sort of cynicism and knowingness. He seemed like a much older guy, although he was young when he made those albums. So that's the flux out of which everything that happened later kind of came. In Mr. Satan's Apprentice, I say basically that I had two black masters, which in its own way is kind of that sounds strange. Is it harkening back to slavery? Well, no, master apprentice is really talking about a master apprentice relationship. And prior to playing on the street in Harlem with Sterling McGee, who I knew as Mr. Satan for years, true story, I had a teacher, harmonica teacher, a guy who heard me playing one night. I was actually at that point, the girlfriend had left. I'd been a street musician on and off for a year and a half or so. I was sort of jamming with bands that would play like on stages for events at Columbia. My friends would get me up occasionally and I'd just blow some harp. And I was walking home from one of those. By the way, I was walking home from one of those one night, and a cab kind of turned around on Amsterdam Avenue. I was walking down Amsterdam to where I lived on 122nd Street. And he turned around and came back and he leaned over. It was a black guy, dark skin, beautiful smile, for charismatic smile. And he said, I heard what you were doing. That sounds really good. And he got out of his car. He opened up, he sort of put I guess in retrospect, it was like a lunch box, but it had and he opened it up, it had a bunch of harmonicas. And so he sort of went, and I'm sitting there going like, not since James Cotton and Magic Dick of the J. Giles Band have I heard this kind of playing live up close. There have been players that I've seen in New York, but and I said, like, who are you? And his name was Nat Riddles. He ended up dying in 91 at the age of 39, I think. He'd had a career at that point that he'd played with a guy named Larry Johnson. He had played with Odetta. He was sort of part of the Gertis folk city scene downtown that Dylan had been in earlier. He knew a lot of people. He'd done some recording. He'd been over to Europe. Horst Lippmann, who did the American Folk Blues Festival, had brought him over with Larry, I think. Many years later, I played a gig or two with Larry, which was its own kind of thing. It's kind of crazy that happened. But Nat was the one who said, basically, you don't really know, you're not tongue blocking. And you don't know, like, do you know who Big Walter is? I go, Big who? You mean Little Walter? He said, Big Walter Horton. So he pointed me towards all of this stuff. Junior Wells. It turned out that my father had the original Hoodoo Man Blues album, which he ended up giving to me, from '66, the first live blues album. So Nat was not only my teacher, we had occasional lessons, but he was also playing in the clubs downtown. He had a famous, sort of infamous kind of 4th of July gig that I write about in Mr. Satan's Apprentice, where he just times it right. He walks outside just as the fireworks are ending on the East River and Dan Lynch is on the corner of 14th Street and 2nd Avenue. It's something else now, but it was a New York blues hub. And so I really, hanging out with him there, playing for him out on the street, and then watching him be a street musician. He had a mouse amp, the same kind of amp I had, the same kind that Sterling had in their mid-'80s in New York. That's what people played through. They're battery powered. I still have two of them. They still work if you switch out the batteries. But he was the one who really gave me what I needed to know so that then I could work it really hard, which I did. And then I could go to Europe in summer of '86 and really busk. I had a couple of guitar players I worked with, and then come back. And it was at that point when I was 86, well, I was 30, 28. And I said, time to get a straight job. Every musician goes through this. Time to put the Panama hat. I had, the kind of like the movie Crossroads. I had one of those Ralph Macchio Panama hats. Eugene Martone. I mean, I saw that just before I ran into Mr. Satan. I kind of lived for real a version of that film, right? With the Mississippi-born blues performer, although Sterling was his own kind of interesting, really unique thing. He'd played with King Curtis. He'd played with Little Anthony and the Imperials. He'd backed up James Brown at the Apollo. He had his own brief recording career, very unique vocals. Anyway, so Nat, Mr. Satan gave me an incredible, they kind of helped me. And I would say with Mr. Satan, starting in 86, we didn't actually record until February of 1990. And I have tapes from all those years. And by about the fall of 89, I suddenly was like, I'd found my voice. And then we went to the studio because I said, if we were to die now or split up or something, like, my kids would never know what their dad did. Can I take you into the studio? I'll pay. Let's just put down some of the stuff we've been doing. And we did. And it was remarkable because I'd never really heard his vocals kind of the way that I heard them when we were in the studio, where suddenly they're dominating. And then suddenly his guitar sound is, you can sort of hear everything. The street is, what's Harlem? What's 125th Street? It's very loud. So anyway, they gave me what I needed. And I would not be here talking with you. I would not be at the University of Mississippi probably teaching blues stuff if that whole chapter of my life hadn't happened. It's my first real memoir, although I've had memoiristic elements in almost every book, but the first real memoir since Mr. Satan's Apprentice in 98. And the top line thing is, it is a story about, and I'll give you 3 frames for it. But the photograph kind of, in some ways, the photograph on the cover says something. It's about a Mississippi family. It's about a family that's come into being in contemporary Mississippi over the past 20 years. It's about how I met and fell in love with and romanced and married my wife of 20 years, Sherry, who was a Black Texan. We met on Match.com, and how we had a child, how we had a son. Who in 2006. So when Obama was elected president in 2008, we're able, and I remember he was asleep, 2 years old, and we're watching that amazing moment. Everybody's talking about Obama. America's no longer racist. It's the post-racial presidency, right? And remember, there was a sense of promise. There's Jesse Jackson, and he's crying. He's in the audience at Grant Park, and I write about that moment. A moment where you feel like, son, I could take my 2-year-old son, someday that could be you. Well, then what happens, right? What happens? There's this dream. So one thing I do, I'll talk about this in a minute, but it's sort of Martin Luther King dream of beloved community or beloved community. That we have a sort of dream that that love can do everything. And then what happens is Gabby Giffords gets shot and Trayvon Martin gets shot, and we have a trial that goes on for a while, and then George Zimmerman's acquitted, and Black Lives Matter is founded. Then we have a Michael Brown, we have Ferguson erupting, we have all this drama. There's a really interesting book by a critic in LA, a film critic, that's all about racial melodrama from Uncle Tom to O.J. Simpson. The spectacle of Uncle Tom being beaten to death by the arch racist Simon Legree. She says basically it's a cultural formation that has never gone away. It's something that people find incredibly powerful. One way to think about what happened with George Floyd and the explosion, the racial reckoning, is that it's the same racial melodrama. I mean, it was a horrible thing to see, but to the extent that it absolutely created an uprising in America, that was Uncle Tom being beaten to death, in this case, strangled. And it pulled every single heartstring. What I was interested in, number one, is what happens to that couple. Well, we're okay. And I have a photo, perhaps you can share it, but people can probably find it. A photo of our son, Sean, in the Grove. He's a freshman at Ole Miss now, which kind of comes just after the end of my book. And me and Sherry, kind of, we're all an Ole Miss family. Now, Ole Miss, wait a minute. Oxford Town, 1962, James Meredith precipitates when he dares to be the first Black person to register to be at Ole Miss, University of Mississippi, precipitates the last battle of the Civil War. Wait a minute, Adam, you're not only going to go to Mississippi, you're going to marry a black woman, you're going to have a mixed kid in Faulkner's town. How's that going to work out? That's what my book's about. If I could, I want to give you, let me say one more thing. So it's sort of about how those cultural and political shifts from Sean's birth, really, all the way to 2022. What's it like for a couple like us? How does that work? Well, long and the short of it is that to the extent that my book has an antagonist, it's actually, this is partly a function of when it was written, it's actually more people just to my left. It's a book about a Kennedy liberal, if you will. My father was a delegate for McGovern and worked for RFK, for Bobby Kennedy. A guy who, I mean, I grew up in a family that felt all those things. And I've always thought of myself as fundamentally progressive. But I saw to my left, I saw whether it was Nicholas Christakis being shouted down at Yale or other things, I saw a kind of rising tide of illiberalism, and it bothered me. It was accompanied by a rising tide of what I'd call hyper-racialism, which is, people talk about the intersectional stack, the idea that, if you're white and male and straight and went to Princeton, you're suspect from the get-go. You're probably the Antichrist. And my book begins with a prologue. It's originally in the middle of the book. My editor said, we're going to start with the train wreck. It begins with a prologue that is, I was trying to write a book about racial reconciliation in the Clinton years. After my Blues and Violence book, it's like, let's go the other direction. And I'm just starting to date Sherry, and I'm doing a book on racial healing, discourses of racial healing in Clinton-era America. And one of the chapters was going to be about, it was like the one that I was least invested in or impressed with, which is white anti-racist workshops for activists in training. I thought, but I got to go. I got to see what this is about. And it's all white people. It was shepherded by two very experienced facilitators. I changed names and locations, so I'm not outing them. But when you enter the room, they go, "Hello, white people." It's sort of deliberately reifying race and whiteness as this problem. Now, I'd had all the years touring with Mr. Satan. I'd been on the road with him and his wife for 7 years on and off around America. We were each other's family, but I'm in this situation. What ended up happening, I'm not going to give it away, just to say, I later learned the term struggle session, because that's what happened. I ended up saying what was felt to be the wrong thing, and people got so upset. And I think of myself as a guy trained in African-American lit, a guy who's thought about these things, been in many black cultural contexts. But from the standpoint of these hard left, race-focused people, I had just said something, and I was silenced. You were going to sit here, the facilitator said, and everybody is going to go and speak at whatever length they see fit. For about 20 minutes, we're going to go, and they're going to tell you how you've offended them. And I end up resisting at a certain moment, and I'm not going to give away what happens, but it's really important that I do that. And what I say, I think, is a moment, hopefully, that produces laughs in some people, because it was very true to the experience that I'd had in Harlem. That's the prelude. That, in a sense, the book is front-loaded with a Roman numeral paginated prologue that says, this doesn't work. This way of, and then I talk about the vision of America that I have, which is grounded in the early 60s. I've taught a course on Freedom Summer. And I want to give you, if I could, there's 3 frames. You want to?
We'd love to hear something if you want to read from it. Absolutely.
What I want to do, actually, I want to give you 3 frames that I'll be doing a reading in a couple of days, and I've thought about these a lot. 3 ways of understanding my book. So, number 1 would be Mississippi and mythologies and the story we all know. The first frame would be an incredible book by Wright Thompson called The Barn, The Secret History of a Murder in Mississippi. It's about the murder of Emmett Till. Wright lives in Oxford. I've never met him, but I listened to the whole thing on a drive back and forth to New York on audiobook. And I was struck by two things. Number one is this is the material that I know, that I teach, those sort of dark chapters of Mississippi history. But what Wright Thompson says is, and I would also say that everybody knows this Mississippi mythology, right? Mississippi it's kind of the blues, and it's race and violence and disrespect. It's like the worst place that had to be broken open by Freedom Summer in '64. But Thompson says this. He goes, Mississippi is a busted place. He told Chris Hayes this. He said, the only hope for it is if there's, quote, a new tribe of us. That's what my book is, a new tribe of us. He also says, writing this book has taught me that our only hope is to create a new unified tribe. What I'm saying is, your prophecy is here, right? And your story is not wrong. Your story is right. It's true. Everybody needs to know it. But that's the Mississippi story also that everybody ultimately thinks they know. And the idea that you could have an interracial couple in Mississippi over the past 20 years and that life could actually be good. And that my argument is basically we've created for ourselves a unified tribe, and that we should be paying attention to these families. Also, he quotes Murley Evers Williams. Yes, Mississippi was, but Mississippi is. The state deserves a chance to break free from its history. That last line is his. The state deserves a chance to break free from its history. And so my book is trying to show you how that works. Among other things, I came from New York. Sherry came from Dallas. Our son is a Mississippian, but maybe the influx of people from out of the state who don't carry that burden the way Wright Thompson, a 7-generation Delta person, carries it. I think that might be important. So it's not Wright Thompson. It's the counterpart to the Mississippi story that everybody knows. Number two, the frame is beloved or beloved community, the social philosophy that underlies the new tribe of us. So here I'm thinking about Martin Luther King, and I talk about beloved community. And I actually, one of my epigraphs, I do want to read this from John Lewis. I got a poster board made up with this. I'm going to use it in my book readings. He says, this is what Lewis told Krista Tippett in On Being, a wonderful interview series, in 2016. He was getting nearing the end of his life. And he said this. He's talking about the early civil rights movement. He says, you live as if you're already there, that you're already in that community, part of that sense of one family, one house. If you visualize it, if you can even have faith that it's there, for you it is already there. And during the early days of the movement, I believe that the only true and real integration for that sense of the beloved community existed within the movement itself, because in the final analysis, we did become a circle of trust, a band of brothers and sisters. So it didn't matter whether you were black or white, it didn't matter whether you came from the north to the south, or whether you were northerner or southerner, we were one. And I think what's amazing there is just the idea that we became a family for each other. And that's where you saw what King was talking about, where he says not just desegregation, but true integration, which is what he said beloved community was. And so I think one thing I'm hoping to do is to sort of resuscitate that idea of beloved community. Maybe, it was driven out by the Black Power movement in 1966, and now it's sort of like people mock it, oh, kumbaya, right? Maybe there's a little more life there than we think. And the third frame is interesting. It sort of comes out of this, which is the Lovings. So everybody's familiar with Richard and Mildred Loving. They're familiar with the Supreme Court decision, Loving v. Virginia in 1967, which took the last of it basically outlawed the remaining anti-miscegenation statutes on the books. They were statutes that said, Adam, you can't marry Sherry. And in Mississippi, it was still on the books. In Alabama, still on the books. In 67, as late as like the year 2000, but in 67, they said basically, no, that those are illegal. You can't do that. So you can marry who you want. We know, and so we've had movies about the Lovings. There's a couple of good movies. We've had, in the 57 years since that decision, what did Richard Loving said? Tell the court I love my wife and it's just unfair that I can't live with her in Virginia. So thanks to James Meredith, thanks to the Lovings, Mississippi, Oxford allows us to get married and just be kind of a normie interracial family in contemporary Mississippi. I think that norminess, the comedy that sometimes enters the picture is important. But here's an interesting thing. So I taught a course, and here we're going to get into book talk. I taught a course, a graduate course, a seminar that was basically about interracial family memoirs. Everybody from Thomas Chatterton Williams, who, by the way, I praise in my book, and he just gave me an amazing endorsement, which I'm delighted to have. Um, James McBride, people may remember, that was a big thing in the late 60s, a black man's like homage to his white mother. There's a lot of other books like that. Joan Steinow Lester, Julius Lester's wife, white wife. Janet Cheatham Bell. We know W. Kamau Bell. We know him. He's a comedian with glasses who's on TV, a black comedian. That was his mom. His mom wrote a book, Mixed Marriage. So, but what's interesting is I finished the course. When I finished my book, I thought, well, let me go back because it's weird. There's no white guys on my syllabus, like no interracial family memoirs by white guys. Like, why is that? By Richard Lovings. He never wrote one. Like we have that thing, tell the court I love my wife. But what else? And I found one. I couldn't believe there was only one. But the one I found, I then asked several emeritus professors whose names would be immediately familiar. I'm not going to out them, but they were people who really know interracial literature. A white man and a black woman. They were both academics, top academics, and neither one of them could think of another book of that sort. But there's one, and it's Cohen. It's William Cohen, the former U.S. Senator from Maine, the former Secretary of Defense. In 2007, he published a book called Love in Black and White, a memoir of race, religion, and romance. And it's about his late life marriage, kind of in his 50s. They didn't have kids, but it's about his marriage to Janet Langhart and about her life and his life. They kind of alternate chapters. But it's a precedent for this, and it's remarkable because there don't seem to be any others. And one question your audience, learned in books as they are, might think about is, why is that? And they should certainly contact you, and you should get it to me if I've missed something, because I can't find. There's one self-published thing that's, again, kind of half by the man and half by the woman. But one question is why. Those books don't seem to be there. Why is Richard Loving's story not in print? So I guess the way I think about it is, Richard Loving and I have nothing in common except we both like cars. I'm a kind of a car guy. I like fast cars. He liked to race cars. But why don't we have Richard Loving's story? And I think my book tries to fill a little bit of that gap and kind of say, I love the heck out of her, and I want you to know that. And that's where my book is coming down.